Stoughton Media Access Corporation is pleased to present International Forum, a new cable show of interest, periodically interviewing foreign newsmakers, bringing them from across the ocean directly to your living room. Here's your host for this week's show.
Hi, welcome to the International Forum. My name is Steve Kelley. I'll be your host today. And today I have the great pleasure of bringing to you Professor Ian Harper from Down Under in the land of Australia. And for those of you who don't know, Australia is the same size as the United States practically, has about 24 million people. So welcome to our show, Ian Harper.
Thank you very much, Steve. Pleased to be here.
All right. And just to tell you a little bit about Ian, Ian has written a book called Economics for Life. He's also the director for Deloitte Access Economics, and he's done a great deal of work for the government in terms of setting minimum wage, things like that. So Ian, how did you get started at first in this field of economics, which the average Joe thinks of as just an awful statistical quagmire?
I thought I was going to be a lawyer, Steve, but I quickly discovered that I don't have a legal mind. I don't think like lawyers think. Maybe that's a good thing. I discovered that economics was much closer to the sort of thing that I really am excited about, and I've been doing that, well, all of my career.
Well, when I read your book, Economics for Life, and that's available on Kindle, I think, right? So, you told a great story about a 10,000 pipe, a grand organ in Melbourne. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think it's just an amazing story.
Well, thank you for that. Yes, it's an instrument in the town hall here in Melbourne. Australia, of course, is a former British colony, so there are a lot of British influences here in this country, and having a large pipe organ in the town hall is an English phenomenon. So we have one here in Melbourne that was built in 1929. It had outlived its usefulness in many ways. It was in need of grand repair. So I happened to be asked by the City of Melbourne, the City Fathers, if I would chair a committee to oversee the restoration and refurbishment of the organ, which we did back in 1999. More or less when it was 70 years old, and that job was done by an American firm, the Chance Organ Company of Orrville, Ohio, were the ones who were awarded the tender, and they've given us an instrument which here we are now 15 years later is still in very fine voice, I can tell you.
Wow, and you know, it's funny because that starts us off on this whole idea of refurbishment, and economies seem to need refurbishment. So along those lines, big changes in the world right now. You've got terrorism in almost every, it doesn't matter when anyone will view this video, I will assume that some form of terrorism has occurred in the world, and that's affecting economies. So what do you say as an economist as to how any group of people, any country can help their economy through that sort of a problem?
Well, Steve, it's a very complex problem, as you know, and when it comes to economics, people's confidence in being able to go about their daily business is important. After all, that's what economics in the end is about. It's everyday business that people engage in to meet their needs and wants. And obviously, if we're under threat, particularly an insidious threat, not so much a war that we can see, but a war that in many ways we can't see and suddenly breaks out on us, affects people's confidence in very negative ways. And that's the biggest negative economic influence. And I suppose if there are those who are trying to break up our accepted lifestyle, then one way to start is to bring the economy to its knees. I think Lenin is reputed to have said that the very first time. It certainly works. If you break an economy, you break a people. And that's why we need to make sure that we go about our business in normal ways and let our defence forces and protective services get on with the job.
Now, Australia, like the United States, seems to have a bit of a geographic advantage, right? We have isolation built in by the oceans. So how do you think that will empower us in the future against terrorism, let's say?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword being isolated like that. Australia is the largest island in the world, on the planet. We are a continent in ourselves. That tyranny of distance, as it's described down here, over the years that we've been here, the Europeans have settled this country for a little over 200 years, it certainly influenced the way our economy has been structured. When it comes to modern warfare, though, I'm not sure that it makes a lot of difference, Steve, apart from cyber attacks, which of course simply ignore distance. Nowadays, people can be right on your doorstep via international air travel in no time at all. And as you've discovered again tragically in the United States only just in the last 24 hours, oftentimes these things are the result of enmity within. You don't actually need to have foreigners turning up. These issues are universal, unfortunately.
Yes. So let me switch gears a little bit for the benefit of our audience. Maybe you could just tell them, what is economics? And further than that, what can it do for them? You know, that saying, what's in it for me? So what is economics?
Sure. Well, the word itself comes from the Greek, actually. It simply means household management. Oikonomos in the original was a Greek household. And so the study of how goods and services are brought to our everyday living rooms, onto our tables, where we get our bread from, how we get work, what sorts of work is offered, the prices at which goods and services exchange, how we meet our everyday needs to satisfy basic needs for living. That's what economics looks at its most basic level. That, of course, becomes quite sophisticated. You've got to think about how companies operate, how governments operate, how decisions are made about wages and prices and inflation and unemployment. All of those things build up from what is a fairly basic set of questions. So what's in it for people? If the economy isn't working properly, you know what's in it. That is to say, there's nothing. There are no jobs, there's poverty, and there's despair. If it works well, then of course there are good-paying jobs. People can meet their needs. They can achieve aspirations that they have for their lives. Economics is about creating opportunity for people to fulfill their material needs. It isn't all there is to life, Steve. That was the theme of my book, Economics for Life. But of course, it's very important. Put it this way, if the economy isn't working, then you discover how important economics actually is.
Tell us a little bit about the spiritual side, because it's not dry to you. I mean, there's more to economics than just numbers and quantitative analysis. So what about the spiritual side of economics from your deep within?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'm an economist because I'm very interested in what makes material goods and services sort of spin around, what in actual fact helps us to meet our material needs. I'm a Christian by profession, that is to say I profess the Christian faith, and Jesus has a lot to say in the Bible about money and about people's needs. Obviously there's a very strong Christian religious tradition, not unique to Christianity I might say, where there's a preference for the poor. Material poverty and deprivation, the lack of adequate material living standard is something which all religions condemn, and certainly Christianity does. So there's a deep theme, if you like, within economics that resonates with a spiritual outlook on life, that you want to try to do what you can to help people. It's the second great commandment, that you love your neighbor as yourself, as Jesus said, and that means helping your neighbor to meet his or her material needs. The thing about economics, though, and again Jesus' teaching on this subject is very clear, is that while it's important, it clearly isn't all there is to life. Jesus talks about his kingdom being not of this world. The spiritual dimension to life transcends the material dimension to life. Again, a theme which is common to religion. Not to say that the material is unimportant, but that it doesn't occupy all there is to human fulfillment. So as a spiritual person, I like to think that my economics helps me to meet that basic requirement of humanity to achieve some adequate material sustenance, but also that to point out to people that there's a whole lot more to life than simply that.
Well, isn't it true, too, that there's an obligation that goes with this material sustenance, as you call it?
Oh, no doubt about that. There's an obligation to care for the environment. And as a Christian, once more, we talk about the need to steward God's creation. And economics speaks to that very issue. Economists spend a lot of time talking about efficiency, and efficiency means minimum waste. That's a theme which is very strong in economics, and that resonates again with a spiritual call to steward creation. There's a call to care for the weak and the poor, and many aspects of economics are directed towards helping understand systems for what we call resource allocation that meet the needs of people, particularly the most vulnerable in communities. So I think there's a great consonance between economics as a discipline and the call that certainly Christian religion makes, I understand it to make on my life, to care for the needs of ordinary people.
Okay, so tie in for me. So that's on a personal level, we have a calling to help those less fortunate, but government also does that. So how do we enable the best of both? And I'll give you a specific. We have a small town here, and I think I mentioned to you that in our sort of pre-setup that we're like having a trouble getting revitalization. And you had talked a little bit in your book, and I think in your report, about how there is usually a primary, then a secondary, then a tertiary economy. The third being a service economy that everybody migrates to after their resources initially start them off, right? So talk to me a little bit about how what is government's role in changing the status of people and place? So we talked a little bit about your idea about place.
Yeah. Steve, there's a very strong tradition in economics answering or attempting to answer precisely your question. What's the appropriate domain of the private sector, where private exchange between buyers and sellers in markets can be allowed to do its job, and the appropriate domain of the public sector, where instead of free exchange there is compulsory taxation and then the provision of goods and services by the state. Where should one stop and the other start? It's a long debate, but broadly speaking, modern economics recognizes the legitimacy of both ways of doing things. So it's not that that economics is all in favor of the market and against the government. It's trying to work out which set of institutions are most appropriate for particular types of problems. Mainstream economics, for example, would say that you don't need the government to be growing food and selling in grocery stores. You can leave that to the private sector. But you get into difficulties when you just leave the private sector purely and simply to deal with health or education. Now, different countries, your country in the United States and mine in Australia, we draw that line in different places. And it's always being moved backwards and forwards depending upon how effective the institutional structure is. I've just recently completed a major report for our own federal government here in Australia, which it's responded to positively, I'm pleased to say, where these very issues are raised, thinking about yet different ways to bring the market discipline to bear on the way public services are provided. So it's an ongoing debate. What's clear is that overall, governments have a responsibility, as we see it certainly in democratic countries, to make sure that these systems, whether they're public systems or private systems, in the end, that they are delivering greater welfare for the people who are the citizens of that government. And the question of how that welfare is distributed, how it's generated, those are questions which governments have ultimate oversight of. So it is the case that oftentimes the market's best at growing the pie, but the government needs to oversee how the pie is sliced up, how the slices are distributed amongst the people. And therefore you find a tension between that process of wealth accumulation, making the pie bigger, and distributing it amongst various people. And different countries reach different conclusions about the way that problem should be solved.
I've got two questions to kind of throw your way. One is about competition in how governments have, at least from my view over in the United States, government is sort of a monopoly. And it's a monopoly in the way that it is empowered to manage the resources of its people. And I think some of your report, I sense that you were saying we can, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but we can demonopolize this function of government by creating competition with the government itself for the services government currently does.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. But no one's taking away the fact that in the end, the government is the monopoly agency for taxation and for raising armies, basically. In democratic states, we give the government that monopoly and we try to contain it because, of course, that can produce an accumulation of power which can be abused. That's essentially, let me not put words in your mouth, but that's the US Constitution.
I'm with you.
We have a similar sort of tension between the accumulation of power and the use of that power for the public benefit. So what we say in our report is that the government should continue to fund these public services unless you raise taxation and pay for these services. In many instances, they simply won't be there, and yet we need them. But what the government doesn't need to do is to provide the services. The provision of those services is often much better handed back to the private sector. So the key then is how the government contracts with the private sector to purchase services that it wants and needs on behalf of the citizens. And what we've said in the report, and again, we're not unique in this, there are other countries around the world, including the United States, where different varieties of these sorts of ideas have been put into practice, is that here in Australia, we need to push harder on that. We need to find new ways in which the government can fall back to its primary role of funding these services and create more space for the private sector to actually deliver the services under contract from the government and as directed by the consumers. So the government, when it's paying for the services, hands the money to individuals, its own citizens, who then direct how these services are provided by interacting with selected accredited providers of the services. That's the idea.
I love that, and I like the way that you're framing it as the government then responding by empowering and engaging the citizens for those services or to provide and deliver those services. So
yeah.
This prevents something which I call flight of capital. So you want to make sure you keep it in-house, and I think that it's a big problem. I wanted you to take a minute to just talk to us about flight of capital, and I'll describe it as an example here in America and in other parts of the world, I'm sure. We have big box stores, and we also have a huge internet purchasing situation that is putting small businesses, the average Joe, the shoe store, the pharmacy that's owned by a small guy or family, and it's putting those under pressure or even out of business. So what do we do? And of course, it's like I talked into Oz. I apologize that, what can we do, Oz? But just in your opinion, what sorts of things can an average person do and start to do to reshape this flight of capital that's occurring?
Yeah. Well, you raise a very important issue, Steve, and it's one that's receiving, I think, more attention in recent times than it has in the past. This is the subject of the work we've just published on the purpose of place that you referred to earlier on. And it's recognizing that we've probably underestimated the extent to which place matters for prosperity, particularly in an era we've lived through, the industrial era, when scale economies drove prosperity. So it mattered that we had large accumulations of factories and people would go to particular places to buy their goods and services. Steve, I'm about to run out of power here and we're up against time as well. Let me just answer that question, but then I might well lose this.
Okay.
The place matters, and the way for people ordinarily to sort of respond to that is a bit of this buy local idea, recognizing that when we gather together in particular places and we support local activity, that creates what economists call economies of agglomeration. It replaces, in a sense, scale economies, generates higher income, improves productivity and prosperity in ways perhaps we hadn't fully recognized. So I think ordinary people should be emphasizing the importance of local activity, which isn't to say you never buy anything. Oh, there it goes.
All right, well, let me close this off. We may have lost your power. Well, thank you for watching. This has been International Forum, Stoughton Media Access Corporation. We also want to thank our team. We have Jeff Pickett, Dave Young, Gina Coe, and Roy Cohen in the background here in studio. And across the land down under, we have Lynette in the background. We want to thank Professor Ian Harper. He's done a fabulous job explaining to us some of the vagaries of economies and hopefully give you a chance as the average Joe to dig into how your economy works and what you might be able to do to make it better. Thank you again for watching. My name is Steve Kelley. I'm your host. This has been International Forum.
This is Roy Cohen, producer and director of the International Forum Show. Thank you for watching, and we welcome your comments to our email address, international.forum@yahoo.com.